So it's been a year, man.
We
And
survived.
we survived. That's the most important thing, actually. Almost a year to the T since we incorporated. And, we actually went back and thought, hey, let's record a 1 year later podcast and see what we have to say. But what was really cool was being able to go back through all the previous episodes that we had recorded, not like the UI versus UI or, the AI videos, but like the old, like the original podcast we were recording. And we were actually talking about a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff that's still super relevant to right now.
Yeah.
Things that we still struggle with, but also some things that we learned along the way, and kind of where we're at now, and a lot of the struggles. A lot of the good moments, a lot of the bad moments. So after a year of running the studio, I thought it would be fun to start with some of the highlights so far. What are your highlights, Charlie, off the top?
I mean, for one, we met the financial target that we set. We can't necessarily disclose that information publicly, but the fact that we hit the goal is awesome. I mean, maybe that's sort of a silly business highlight. In terms of actual highlights.
Paying yourself to run your own business, I think, is huge. It's a huge success.
That's true.
I'm super stoked about it. We're kind of building our own way here, and there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And the first thing you fear when you're doing that is financial uncertainty. You have bills to pay, you have lots of things to pay. And when you embark on this, having that sense of security after a year where you're okay, we've actually hit our targets, I think for sure that's a highlight for me as well.
Yeah, because I guess you hear so many stories of people who start an agency or any business really, and it's the first year you're just burning your savings or whatever. And then we were lucky to never have to do that. I mean, there was a few months in the very beginning where we were not paying ourselves what we wanted, but I think in general, it's been smooth sailing on that front. And to that point, I mean, we've also gotten clients pretty much consistently. And more importantly, at least so far, 85% of our client base is exactly in the industries that we wanted to work with, which is another, I mean, it's kind of, I don't always believe it that it happened,
I have to agree. That's it's crazy that we've been so lucky to work with the clients that we've been able to work with, doing meaningful projects, or at least people who are trying to do meaningful work.
Yeah.
I think that's really why we started this thing. And it's cool to see okay, we worked with a healthcare app, we worked with a sustainability app, we worked with education apps, and are continuing to work with those 3 different domains. I think we're expanding a little bit, but we can leave that for maybe lessons learned.
Yeah, I mean...
but that's so exciting, and the cool thing is also the more we work with these clients, the more we get to work with these type of clients,
Yeah, for sure, because I think we'd even heard that feedback. People would go on our website and then they would see, oh, you work with these kinds of clients and that's what we're looking for. So that's very encouraging to hear. Do you have any highlights? I gave the money and the clients one.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are 2 big ones, but the things that those fund are also our internal projects. One of the things for me as a personal area of growth and within the studio, the idea of generating content was always very far from my mind. It's something that I was kind of skeptical about, maybe nervous to do, but it's been such a fun experience doing that with you, honestly, coming up with ideas together and realizing that if we're going to exist as a studio, we do have to put ourselves out there in different ways, and finding creative ways to do that has been awesome.
Yeah, that has been really fun. And we got a few comments this morning, actually, that were very encouraging on the YouTube channel. So that was nice to see. And I think for me, it's the opposite, right? Because I've always wanted something where content was a big part of it. And so my version of the positive there is that it's happening.
Yeah.
I've always thought if ever I owned a company, whether it's making a product or a studio, there has to be some way where there's information that's being generated and put out there. And for me, what was always important was that it's not just, here's why our studio is the best, or here's why our product is the best kind of information, right? I always thought it would be amazing to have just general contribution to the field of whatever it is work that we're doing. And I think we're sort of achieving that, right? Pretty much. Yeah, I don't think a single piece of our content besides this podcast is about the studio. And even then, this podcast is very reflective, and we're not really trying, hey, hire us for these reasons,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting to talk to other people who own studios who have they have their Instagram, they have their socials, they have this and that, and we've made an intentional choice to not necessarily go down those roads because, one, it's a huge time investment, but also it's not necessarily how we want to put ourselves out there,
And you want to do those things right if you're going to do them. I think that's really important.
Okay, so those are some of the highlights, of which there were many. I mean, honestly, I can think of a bunch more, but for the time being, we'll keep it at that.
All right.
What about some of the lowlights?
What about you kick this one off? I kicked off the highlights.
Yeah, I'm down. One of the things that happens with any job, even when you have your own studio, you get burnt out on things, whether it's client work or whatever it is. You know, one of the advantages about having a studio is you get to work on so many different projects all the time, but it doesn't change the fact that you're still sitting in front of the computer a lot, still kind of doing design work a lot, and it can get a little tedious and tiresome sometimes. It's just part of being a designer, you know. It's a real part of it. It's a real part of any job. Not every piece of a job is glamorous, something that I think you and I both accept, but I would say that's one of the lowlights. Figuring out how to find motivation when in a rut, in a design rut.
Yeah, and maybe one thing that's also kind of interesting about having your own business when it comes to lows is there's no one to turn to. You know, that's one thing about being employed. There's a lot of, I feel, generally people are like, oh, owning your own business and freedom. And for sure, you get lots of that stuff. The flip side is when something isn't going like you wanted. On the one hand, there's no one to blame but yourself. But it's not even about blame in this particular case. It's more like, you know, there's nobody to support outside of the other business partner. And then if it's like specific things that you wish you could offload to someone else, maybe because you need an emergency break, you know, like you want to take a burnout time off, you can't do that as easily, especially if the alternative is being employed by a company with a really nice vacation policy and sick leave policy. So that's for sure something that I've also felt, honestly, where some days it's like, you know, or like some tasks or just certain things where it's like, oh, what? Like this is something I'd never thought about until I owned a company.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when tax season came around, well, for one, thank God we have an accountant. Because if we didn't have an accountant, I would probably be buried right now. But even with an accountant, right, there's like other stresses that come up with regards to that. And again, the kind of thing that like when you're an employee, you're just like doing your hours, you get the money and you leave, you know. And then here it's like, oh, wait, we spent this bill when and why? And how does this like fit in with the so learning about finance, and I have a higher tolerance for that maybe compared to like you and I assume maybe other creatives who might want to jump into something like this. And even I was like burning out at some point with just like it's just so frustrating. And government websites.
Yes. Yeah,
oh my
navigating
God.
Government websites. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah. They're designed specifically to stress you out and confuse you, it seems like sometimes.
Yeah.
Without an accountant, it's literally impossible to navigate some of these things.
For
as
sure.
UI designers, it brings me a lot of shame that those are government websites.
Other lows, I mean, when work starts to slow down at certain points, you're just wondering, can I sustain this? That's a question that every now and then pops into my head, especially when...
I think that's a big one.
Yeah.
I mean, do you mean like when work starts to slow down, is there going to be another thing?
Yeah, exactly.
That anxiety? Yeah.
Exactly.
That anxiety is bad. I think that's the main anxiety of a studio owner is how, you know, that next client, that next thing coming up, you know? And sometimes that can be a dark place. You're like, okay, well, is there going to be another thing coming up? And we've just been like super fortunate. You know, I think we've both been working for long enough that we've had the opportunities that we've had, but that anxiety doesn't go away.
Right. I think to a degree, like recording the content because it's our own product, I feel like that sort of helps because it's something to think about and to keep doing when you're not sure if another contract's coming up. Like in our case, we haven't actually had a period where there was no work, but we have had periods where like all of a sudden nobody's reaching out anymore, or all of a sudden nobody answers the call outs we put out, or, you know, we go back to someone else who's like, oh, reach out to us in the future, maybe we'll have something, and all of them have nothing. You know, so that during those times I feel like having your own thing to do helps. I mean, even when we were working on the plugin, the Figma plugin, Figdone, there was an element of like, you know what, like maybe there's no clients right now, but at least we're building our little thing here, and that's fine. So I guess it's a bit like in life, you know, it's like having a side project or something. You know, like if you don't have one, it can feel like when the work stops, it's like, but at least it's like, oh, you know what? This is maybe a nice thing. You have a bit of time to work. But still, to this day, I have that thought. Like right now, we don't have a problem with generating clients. And I still think like, what about next year? You know?
Totally. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
And it's a good way to think. I mean, I think that kind of transitions nicely into like some of the lessons we've learned, you know. You talked about how balancing the client work with your own product or whatever it is that you're developing, you know, as a studio. I don't know if that's like a lesson that could be globally applied, but I guess more globally, how much time you put back into the studio. So I think one of the things we learned was it's hard to balance time between working on the studio and working in the studio. You know, they're
Right.
two separate things. Like working in the studio is doing the client work that comes down the pipe. You kind of run through your list of tasks, and oftentimes you end up pushing things that are related to the studio, you know, like, okay, well, it's not generating direct income. It's not clear what the value of this thing is. So I'm just going to push it to the bottom. I think we've done a couple of things to try and combat that. Like, first off, we kind of created our own project within our kind of task management system that's just for us as a client in a way, which I think was an important framing. So when we're creating tasks, we add them to our own backlog of things that we need to do. So they
Right.
exist in the same space. That helped a lot for me personally. You mentioned, I think, maybe hiring or having other people work on studio stuff together.
Yeah, especially content, right? That's one where people might think, oh, it's hard to do, or, you know, I don't have the skills for it. And then the problem with content also is that, like, the return on investment isn't clear or obvious, and it might take years. But I guess that's where on the studio versus in the studio, some things you just have to make the time for it. There's no other way. And so for us, we made the conscious effort to make time for recording a podcast 2 hours a week and then sending that to an editor who then sends it back to us. We give feedback. So even though we have the editor, there's still like quite a bit of stuff we have to do, from planning to recording to feedback approval. But we made the time for it. Whereas other things, like let's say the website, you know, this morning, we just deprioritized the contact page redesign because we don't want people to contact us right now. You know?
We're not getting, you mean those valuable devs that are reaching out and designers from every kind of corner of the globe looking for jobs are not super helpful? Or those marketing guys who are like, you need growth marketing strategy.
You need some SEO. Yeah. No, but really, you know, like, I do think we have to upgrade the website. And then it's funny how, like, when we're not getting clients, we're like, okay, quickly, let's upgrade this so that when we reach out to someone, they see the latest version of it. And then the minute we get a new contract, we immediately pause all the work on the website. But I actually think that makes perfect sense, right? Because what's the work in service of? And a website, unfortunately, these days, people don't just randomly browse websites, right? They only kind of find it if they're looking for it. And then for us, it's like, if it's not optimal when we're also fully loaded, it's not a big deal, you know, especially because we know it's good enough. Whereas something like content is inherently something you sort of, yes, there's a strategy and all that stuff, but a big part of it's just putting it out there and seeing what happens. And so that one, you can't just deprioritize it when you're too busy, because otherwise it'll never get prioritized.
I mean, to me, it kind of touches on a variety of different parts of what we do, you know, whether it's like, okay, you doing your part in QuickBooks for as long as you can and sort of prototyping your own ways of dealing with it, to us kind of even prototyping our own version of content before deciding to hire an editor, like really thinking about things in stages, you know, just do it, even if it's not 100%. And then if it's worth investing in, you'll see that, you know, there will be an indication, whether it's your own frustration with QuickBooks where you're going to explode if you don't get additional support from a qualified accountant, or it's like really bringing content to the next level by hiring an editor, or it's working on the website, you know?
Yeah, that prototyping thing, I guess, is like essential, and it's defined the way we approach this whole project. I mean, I even think of the studio as a project in some weird ways, right? It's like,
yeah, of course.
Stage 1 was get a client and see what happens. And then stage 2 is like, okay, like brand yourself, you know, and then see what happens. And then stage 3 is like, okay, we have processes. Now let's start doing some outreach. And then I guess what's coming up next is growing the studio. And that's a giant question mark. I don't know if that's a lesson learned, but it's certainly like an anxiety to a degree where it's like, we want to grow it, but we don't know exactly when and how. And it's funny because we have a whole episode on when to hire our first person. I don't think anything has changed in a way.
Yeah. So I think that's still a question mark. And if you're looking for a job and you're a super talented designer, just leave a comment, reach out. We want to have you in our network.
So yeah, that's one lesson learned. I guess another one for me is every client is very different. And I know this sounds like obvious, but it's also remarkable how different they can get. And we've worked with startup, sort of mid-size, massive, non-profit and for-profit, right? Like we've worked with every permutation, and even the ones that are technically in the same category don't work the same way. And yeah, just the number of things you have to adopt, especially when you're a tiny studio like ours, where we can't come in with a cookie cutter process that we've developed and sort of like have the client follow us. It's a lot harder for us to do that. So just constantly having to like readapt. It's honestly, it's not a bad thing.
Also, though, you know,
we don't want to yet, you know. Yeah.
Maybe it's the only way to scale is to be cookie cutter, but part of our philosophy, I feel like, is to be more adaptive. So how can you create an adaptive cookie cutter scalable system? That's the big question.
I think that's actually also part of why we're not expanding, right? That always comes up is like, if you expand, you start to bring that kind of red tape in, and then you start to become more rigid. But we're trying to figure out how to not be super rigid. And so everything we're trying to do there is trying to be done with a lot of intention and care. I guess one thing that I want to add on top of that for intention is like the number of times we've said no is almost shocking to me at this point. And it's something that whenever we tell people, they're always like looking at us like we're crazy. Like, why don't you just say yes to everything?
I agree. I mean, it's in some ways you're defined by what you choose not to do more than what you choose to do, it seems like, especially when you're in a position where you've been around long enough that people know that you can reliably get certain things done. But I don't know, just there's a lot of power in saying no.
Yeah, and that's a little bit like with what we said about content. You just have to make the conscious effort to record that content. And the same thing goes here. It's like, if you say yes to everyone, then you're never going to have time to work on the business. You're never going to have time to get the ideal client, and you'll just be a studio of circumstance as opposed to a studio of intention. And so I think that's something that for us was something we didn't want to step down from. Like 4-day work weeks, you know, we just tell people right up, it's like we don't work on Fridays.
And it's scary. It's scary to say that for me.
Yeah, because you're a little bit worried, like, are they going to tell us to go away? I think we're also lucky because we're doing it at a time where others are starting to do it, so it's not completely alien. But there are some people who championed the 4-day work week like a few years ago, and those guys must have really had to figure out how to communicate like, hey, you know, we're like 1 in 1 million. Yeah.
The whole thing, like we deal with different fears and anxieties throughout this whole process. This whole year has been filled with a variety of different kind of roadblocks and successes. I think my favorite part of this whole thing is how dynamic it is, you know? Like, I feel like I'm at the wheel. It's a lot of responsibility. It makes things a lot scarier, but I feel pretty alive. So that helps.
Yeah, and I want to capture one thing from the notes, which is like the importance of choosing the right business partner. I'm like not here to be like, oh, we're the best business partners ever or anything, but just like making sure there's like baseline level of compatibility and agreement on everything is actually much more important than many of the other factors, right? Like you can get as many clients as you want, but if you're not able to agree on like what the studio should become, the whole thing is going to fall apart. So you can have the best sales machine in the world, you can have the best designers in the world, but if the business owners aren't in agreement and they're not figuring out how to communicate when it's rough, then that's kind of what's hard. Yeah, because you're saying you feel like you're in control, you're at the wheel. And so yeah, that's true, right? It's like all of that comes together in between the business partners, and then you guys can control it together. But if you can't control it together, then it's awful, and then it dies anyway.
I think that's been the biggest thing as well. And I'm very grateful to have you as a business partner, Holmes, for what it's worth.
Yeah, man.
That on public record now.
Yeah. It'll make it that much harder when things go south.
No, don't say that. Don't jinx it. Look, we've been lucky this far, so hopefully the luck keeps going. It's surprising to me how well we've worked together, you know? There's always little hiccups in every relationship, of course, but I'm constantly surprised.
Yeah, at least the hiccups are always like good hiccups, you know? It's never like bickering. It's important stuff for the most part. So yeah, that's a year in review. The good, the bad, and the learned. If you guys are listening because you're interested in starting a studio for yourself, you know, it's like, as much as I want to believe that this can be useful, also like a lot of it's gonna have to be your own path. But I think intention is probably one of the most important things, the right business partner, and iterating, trying to... Yeah, exactly. Just like, don't overthink it. Don't overproduce it either. And more importantly, like, if you do these things, intention, not overproducing, then when things are going like south or something is rough, it's much easier to remember the value of this journey, right? I'm not just doing this because it's better than being employed. Like, that's not the singular reason, you know? No. It's like, we have some idea about what design should look like or feel like, or who we want to work with and why, and how. And so it's all about aligning those things so that when things aren't amazing, you can keep on track. A little moment of inspiration.
Keep on track. I like that.
Awesome. Yeah, you can stay tuned to the channel if you want to keep up with what we're doing and see all our other shows. Cheers. Bye.